introduce our speakers today, our own Bill and Susan Snyder. Susan Olson Snyder was introduced to genealogy when she joined a family research class after moving to a new home in Virginia. She has been researching for about 40 years. A native of Louisville, Kentucky, she is active member of LGS and has served as our quarterly editor, as vice president and president. Bill Snyder has been focusing on genealogy for almost 40 years. His concentrations have been mainly in Virginia, in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. He also has carried out research in German and Norwegian records. He has served as treasurer, newsletter editor, and also president of LGS. And he's a fourth cousin of mine, we found out one time on a research trip. So I get to introduce one of my cousins, which is an unusual thing to do here in Louisville since I am from Michigan originally. So I welcome Bill and Susan Snyder to our workshop today.
All right, thank you, Nancy. Okay, hopefully everyone can see this on their screen. If you can't, you can send a chat and say, no, I'm having trouble with this, but we'll try to take care of you. Of course, Nancy said that I'm Susan Snyder and Bill is my husband and he's over here. And he's doing the tech work, make sure everything keeps on running. So hopefully we won't lose anybody. We're awfully glad to see such a nice group, so many places here. And I just wanted to tell you one thing about the polling. We're working on making sure we know how to do the polling properly before our seminar comes up in October. And there will be a couple of polling questions. In fact, I see Phil has put one at the bottom of the page already. If you would be so kind to open that and answer the poll and send it back to us, and then Phil will send us the results of that. This is a test because we want to do this for the seminar in October. So if you would take care, it looks like people are doing it right now. And it'll just go away in just a few seconds. All right, first thing we're going to do is talk about what are vital records. These are usually records that are birth, death, or marriage, and they were mandated by some government entity. Now, not all states did this at the same time, and even different records for the particular state were done at different times. And if you'll notice on your handout when you get one, at the very top there's a URL that you can go to and print out a really nice handout that tells you the year that each of the birth, death, or marriages were instituted in that particular state. And that's pretty important because if you're looking in the wrong place or the wrong time, you're not going to find it. These records were usually available late in the 19th and early 20th century, and they are primary sources because they were created at the time of the event. Let's see. Okay, now let me see if I can get my computer to work again. All right, here we go. All right, this dapper gentleman is kind of sitting there pondering what are these births, deaths, and marriages, and where can I find them? And this happens to be Bill's great-grandfather, Henry Kimmel. Now, the question is, why can't I find these vital records? Well, they may not have been available in the time period that you're looking. And like I said, that's important. You need to know exactly the time that they started. It's also important to know that sometimes the states didn't get up and running at the exact time they were mandating these. So maybe if you're right on that edge, you may not find what you're looking for. They could have been destroyed by some natural event, maybe a fire, flood, a hurricane, who knows. So you have to consider that. You might even want to do some research and to find out what was going on at that time. It's possible they were never recorded. Some people didn't always abide by the rules when they started something new, or they didn't know about it. And maybe you're even looking in the wrong place. Just because couples lived in a particular state or county doesn't mean that they actually married there. They may have gone somewhere else because it was more advantageous. Maybe they didn't have the same regulations, or it was just closer. So if you can't find them where you think they should be, then expand your looking. What about using alternative records? If you want to, the best thing to do is to look for multiple sources. And then you have to consider the accuracy of these sources. Consider the who, the when, and the why. Who was it that created the record? When did they create it? Did they create it at a time that it was certainly known what the exact date or place was? And were they involved in the creating that it was important to them, or maybe it was something that they just thought, well, I think I'll write this down. So you got to consider all those things when you're looking. If you find 2 or more records and they don't agree, then you need to compare them and figure out what's correct. Any conflicts that you have, you need to resolve them. And you have to keep in mind that some of these don't always give you a definitive answer, but they may only hint at the answer. So sometimes that's all you've got. So it's the best you can do. And the records that I'm putting up here, I put them in alphabetical order, so they're not in any order of importance. Some may be more important to you for one event and not for the other. So everybody wants to find a family Bible. I'm still looking for my first one, but maybe someday. But you know, they have births and deaths and marriages in these Bibles, and they're wonderful if you can find them. But how accurate are they? Now this particular one, and hopefully you can see this, it wasn't the best copy, but it looks like there are multiple people that wrote in this book. Now this one goes from maybe 1870, I believe, to the early 1900s. Now that's possible. Somebody could have lived through all of these events and wrote them down and knew when firsthand. But sometimes you find that the same person wrote the whole thing, and then you've got to go back and you look at the copyright of the Bible, and the Bible was copyrighted after some of the events in the book. So you know they weren't written at the exact same time as the event occurred. So that's something you have to consider. Birth announcements. Now everybody gets birth announcements, and the one on the left here is an announcement that came in a Christmas card. And of course it was written by the parents, so we can assume it's pretty accurate. And then also we have email announcements. Have you ever gotten an email for a birth? We have, and those are very telling. This one was sent by a grandparent, so we assume that's pretty good. Cemetery records. Now this isn't the sort of thing you're going to find on Find a Grave necessarily. This came from the office of the cemetery. So if you ever go to a cemetery and you go to the office and ask where's so-and-so buried, don't forget to ask and see if they have any record on the people that were involved in the burial, the person that bought the plot. Sometimes they show how much they paid for it. But this one, in this case, it gives the woman's birth date and her death date. Now you have to take that birth date with a grain of salt, depending upon who gave the information. In this case, I know this was her husband. He may or may not have known for sure, but it's worth writing down, and then you have something to check with. Cemetery tombstones. And we've all seen these, we've all used Find a Grave, but they're not always accurate, especially if the tombstone was replaced later on, maybe years later, when one of them had fallen in disrepair or had the writing had washed away and somebody came along and put up a new one. This happens to be my grandparents, and it showed their birth, death, and their marriage date. So they're very valuable, but you have to check and make sure they're accurate. And we all love the census records. This is a federal census. And what can you tell from this? Well, this happens to be in 1900, and it does give a month and a year for the birth. And depending upon who gave the information will determine how accurate that was. It also asks, how many years have you been married? So you're going to be able to calculate an approximate marriage date from that. So don't overlook these things. Different censuses are going to give you different information. There's also state records. This happens to be a Wisconsin record. And this is telling you the age of the person at their last birthday. Now, this is a 1905 census. That doesn't mean their age in 1905 necessarily, because this goes from the first day of June, 1905. So they could have been born in 1904 also. So think about that. Read the top of your census to make sure what you're actually looking at. Birth record, these are church records. This is a baptismal certificate. Now, fortunately, this one had a birth date on it because this woman wasn't baptized until she was 13. So I couldn't take her baptism date and assume that she was born shortly before that. Fortunately, they gave it to us. But these are always nice to have. You can go to the church. Most churches, if you know where it is, they can get that information from them. And something else about church records. You don't forget to look at church histories. I have found, especially in smaller congregations, that sometimes they will have lists in these histories of early members, maybe baptisms of the children, confirmations, something along those lines, so that you can get the date, or at least an approximate date of a birth from that. City directories. Well, now you say, well, what does that have to do with somebody's death? Well, I was looking for this Michael Goss, and I started in the city directories here in Louisville, and I was going along, and he was the same every time, and all of a sudden, because I didn't know when he died, all of a sudden I see Josephine Goss, his wife, who is now the widow of Michael. And underneath it, Justina Goss, this is Michael's parents. She's the widow of Thomas. So that I know within the previous year that Michael or Thomas, whenever that was, has passed away. Now, I think sometimes in the city directories, they don't always catch a death when they're publishing. So you might have to go back a couple of years. But this is telling because all of a sudden the widow shows up. Coroner's records. Now, if there's an accident, then you want to look for a coroner's record. This one came from South Carolina, and it was about a train wreck. The gentleman was killed. It gives the exact date of the death. It gives the circumstances of the death. And if you read on, there were several pages of witnesses that gave deposition to the events of that happening. So those are very interesting if you have somebody involved in that. I have one of my ancestors was killed in a train wreck, but I've not been able to find the coroner's report yet. There is a list I've found out on the internet that gives different states and what kind of records they have available. Sometimes they're coroner's records, sometimes they're something similar. They go by different names depending upon the state, but it's worth checking into. Correspondence, and I'm talking about letters, maybe some diaries, or just, this is a postcard that's been floating around on my desk for some time now. It was written to my grandmother from a niece of hers. And my mother had told me that this woman had had 2 marriages. She gave me the names, the first names of both men. But I started reading this and I said, it says, I married again 2 weeks ago on January the 30th. She didn't give me a year, but fortunately I was able to read the postcard and read the postmark on the card, and it was 1954. So she's talking about her daughter, and I knew her daughter. She's about my age. And this didn't fit in with either of the other two marriages that I had. So now I've discovered she had a third marriage, and she's given me the date of it and the place. So don't discount this kind of information and say, oh, I've already got that. You have to look at it and see if it fits in with what you already know.
Question here.
Okay, we have a question.
We have a question. Somebody wanted to know about finding a list of coroner in reports.
Well, what I did was to find that list, I just searched online, just went to Google and searched coroner records, and this came up with these things. I can try to find that and see if we can get that out to everybody. Maybe I can post it on Facebook. But Nancy, would that be okay if we post that link on Facebook?
That sounds wonderful. I can do that.
Okay, we'll find that. All right, getting back here, court records. Now, you might think that's a little bit of a stretch, but this so happens to be from Salem, Massachusetts. They were quarterly courts. If you see in the top left-hand corner of this page, it says 1669. That happens to be the year. So we're getting into some time where there's not going to be a lot of information about people's ages. But if you notice down at the bottom, the case that they were working on is listed at the top of the page, and at the bottom there were different depositions from people. And this John Corliss is who I was interested in. And it says he's aged about 21 years. Okay, that gives me what? It tells me he was born about at least 1648. Somewhere around there. And they did this for, it looks like, everyone. There's a John Hutchin, he was age 65. There's another one at the bottom, which gives an age. So you may not think of looking like for this kind of thing in a court record, but it's obvious that was important to them. And that is the only record that I have found stating anything about this man's birth. So especially on older records, you might look at something like that. Divorce records. I've had trouble finding divorce records, especially if they're early, but this one I was able to locate. And you don't want to just look at when the divorce was granted. You want to look through the whole record, see what's in there. This happened to be the direct examination of the woman involved in this case, and the questions that they asked her, and one of them was, when were you married? And where were you married? That's pretty simple, and she gave the answers, and she should be the one that knows. It was a few years after her marriage, but nevertheless, she had the information right there, and she's giving it to you, so don't look past some of these things. Immigration and immigration records. This is an immigration record. It was created in Norway when this gentleman was leaving to come to America. And it gives the date he left, it gives his name, and it also gives his birth date. So don't discount those things. Employment records. This was my grandfather. I was able to find that. He was worked for the CNW Railroad. And there it is right there. He gave his birth date. Funeral cards. We all have several of these in our possession. The one on the right is from a Catholic funeral, and they usually gave the birth and the death and might have had a prayer on there. The one on the left is the typical thing that you find in a funeral home, which gives you a birth date, death date, and when the service took place. And funeral home records. Now, these are a little bit different than the cemetery records. You might find similar information, but this one has the birth and death of the person. It'll tell you sometimes where they were, what cemetery it was. If you can't find them for older funeral homes and they've been out of business, if someone else took over the funeral home, you might go there, see if they still have the old records. If not, You might try a historical society or a library. I know the Filson Historical Society has some of the older funeral home records here from Louisville. So it's worth checking because there's a lot of good information. I found some for my family that actually told you the type of carriages they had, who rode in each carriage, how many they had. It'll have the bills attached to them, who paid for them. They're all very interesting. Guardianship records. Now, this one happened to be part of a probate file. The gentleman had passed away, and he and his wife were only married for about 3 years, and they had a baby. So they had this young son, and the wife had gone to court to petition to be the guardian of her child, and she was granted that. Well, this one is several years later. It's still part of the probate file, and it says that she's come to court and that she has fulfilled her duty as the guardian, but now the son is 21 years of age, and it's time for her to give this up. He's on his own. So here's an indicator of how old he is when he was born, just in this one record. We have military records, drafts, and enlistments from World War I. It states the date of their birth, and this information was given by the person, so it should be pretty accurate. Same thing for World War II. There's the birth date right there and the place of birth. This is an honorable discharge record. It's not in very good shape because this was like a 2 by 3 inch card that someone carried in their wallet, and it was damaged. It looked like it got wet, but still it's got his birth date on there, which I'm sure he gave when he enlisted in the Army. Mortality schedules. Now these were created when the census were created in 1850 through 1880. Now, people will say, well, that's when someone died in the census year that they will appear on this list. But you have to read this one very carefully also, because it says persons who died during the year ending 1st June 1870. So this is going to cover the first 5 months of 1870 and the last 7 months of 1869. So just, you say, well, I didn't have anybody that died in 1870. Well, did you have anybody that died in 1869? Well, they could very well be on here. And this gives you the age. So you would have a birth date approximated. And it also gives you the month of the death. Now, you know it's August, so it has to be 1869 that they died. So read carefully what's at the top of each page. Mortuary records. These are usually late 19th and early 20th century also. Now you notice this one has an age of the person, and it also has the date of death on there. So you can get birth and death. These are compilations of information that came from funeral homes. You don't always find these, but they're handy. They have you a lot of information in there you may not see other places. So you need to check these out. Naturalization records. This is a petition for naturalization. And of course, the gentleman had to say when he was born, where he was born. And also, if you look down a little bit farther on this page, it says to list the names, birth, and places for all of their children. So this not only has his birth date, it has all of his children's birth dates, where they were born and when. And newspapers, we love newspapers because they have so much information. How accurate it is, you have to check it out. But this list of marriage licenses, now that's wonderful because it gives you an indicator of probably when they got married, at least when they got a marriage license, but don't assume that they actually was a marriage based upon a license. because sometimes they called it off before they actually got to the altar. Births, this one is 1916, a list, and all it says is that there was a girl born to this couple on June the 11th. So maybe you've got a list of children, maybe you have names, maybe you don't even have names, but you know they had some children, so here's another one you have to stick in there. Now it's your job to find out what her name was and where she fits into the mix. This death record I have, it's not quite an obituary, it's not much to it at all, but I looked for this man for a long, long time. He was in the 1930 census, gone in the 1940, had no idea where he was in between. He wasn't with his wife anymore. I found his burial. He was buried in Illinois. Well, what happened to him in between? He has such an unusual name, Chevlish, which wasn't his name at all. It was spelled many ways. He was even called Sam in one record. So I just happened upon this, and after reading it, I wanted to get a death certificate. And they wouldn't let me give him ask for a death certificate until I had it narrowed down at least to a month and a year. So once I did that and I sent for it, and sure enough, there was enough information on that death certificate that confirmed who he was, and he was my ancestor. And then I found out from here what caused him to die. He fell down the steps. Obituaries, we love obituaries. And the one on the right is the typical thing that you would find in a newspaper or electronically anymore. They don't seem to be printing many of them. And then the one on the left has birth information, death information, the usual thing. But it also said when she was 22 years of age, she was married. So now you can figure out approximately when she got married to this gentleman. Now this came from a religious publication. So if you can't find one in the paper, think about, did they belong to a particular religion or a church? See if they did publish something. This is the Seventh-day Baptist Church, and they had a publication for probably 100 years or more, and it's still in print today, and it is online. They have an archive that is online, so if you have any people that belong to this, they have very nice obituaries in there. Passenger list, we've all seen those if we have someone, and they always include the age of the person. It may not be exactly right, but maybe it'll give you a hint as to where you can look. Passport applications. If you had someone who maybe came to America, but then they went back to their home country, and that happened quite a bit. They went back to visit family. Well, they had to have a passport to go. Passport applications are online up through 1925, and after that you have to write for them. But they do give you a birth date listed on there, so they're worth looking at also. Pension records. This was the War of 1812, and this was a widow who is applying for one for her husband who had passed away. And there's a lot of information on here that's useful. The wife's birth age, so you can calculate her birth from that, the day she was married to this man, and also the day of her husband's death. And very possibly you will find documents listed in this pension record that support that information. And prison records. This isn't exactly something a lot of people will be looking for, but if you do, then they're out there. This one, I wasn't sure that this even existed. And then when Cindy from Cindy's List was here, I asked her, I said, do you have any prison records on your list? And she said, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, I do. She said, I think they're from Montana. Well, it just so happened, I was doing some research for a friend of mine, and she said, I have an uncle who was in prison in Montana. I thought, what's the chances of that? But sure enough, it gives very descriptive information on here. It gives his age, it gives his birth date, the where and the when. And I'm sure if he had died in prison, it would have given you that information also. So they're out there. I saw one just the other day from another state where they are starting to put their prison records online. So if you haven't thought about those, that's one you might want to do. Phil, can we have another poll, please? Our second question.
Just click on poll.
Okay, there it goes. Well, I'm glad to see I'm giving you some new hints. All right, school records. You can find school records a lot of times, and this one on the left is one where it gives the parents' names, it gives the children's names and their ages. And this is an 1894 record. They are quite prevalent. I've found several throughout the state of Kentucky, some older records, so those are really nice to have. And on the right, this is a graduation invitation. And you know, it's not going to give you an exact birth date, but if you know someone graduated, and usually they're 20, 21, 22 from college, you can get an approximate date. And once you've got that, at least you know where you can look for that more information on that. Everybody knows about the Social Security Death Index, but we need to include it because it's important, and it gives a birth and a death date on that. Social Security number application. This one you have to mail far, and it does cost you. This is not a very good copy, but that's what I paid for, and I was glad to get it. It has my grandmother's birth date and her age on there and where she was born. And it's information I did not know because she was adopted. I was hoping to find her parents' names, but that didn't happen. So, but at least I have confirmation of her birth. Tax list. Now, tax list, they can be telling. This is a Virginia tax list from Culpeper County. And there's John Snyder down there. And the first column says whites over the age of 21. So I know an approximate time for his birth, at least a before time. So that's something. Now this is the way I use tax list. I create a spreadsheet. Now this is John up there under column B. And I knew he was moving from Culpeper, Virginia, over to Pendleton, West Virginia, what's West Virginia now. And so I was tracking him, and the tax records started in 1782. So he was in Culpeper for the first 3 years. Then I found him in 1785 in Augusta County. By 1789, he was in Pendleton, and he stayed there. And all of a sudden, he wasn't there anymore. He didn't show up in the records, but his wife, Catherine, did. So I'm assuming that he passed away at that time. I haven't found any other records to dispute this. Now, she was only on the tax list for a couple of years. Now, I don't know if she died. Chances are she probably went to live with one of her children, and she was counted on their list. So this is incomplete from what I was doing, but he was the one I was searching for most. So you can take those records and make something out of them, make assumptions, but then you have to find something else, hopefully, that will confirm that. Voter registrations, these are out there too. They will give you an age and they'll give you a place. This one is age 78 and born in Illinois. So there's something else that you can use to pin down a birth. Weddings, there's information here on the right. It doesn't mean they actually got married. They sent the invitation out and their intentions were good. I happen to know personally that this one did happen, but you can't always say that it did. The one on the left is actually a thank you note with the day of the wedding. So I know that that one is probably a good thing. And wills and probate. Now, it's great if your will happens to have a date on it, then you can take the probate date and you know that the person passed away somewhere in that time period. Not all wills are dated. We've had several of them that are not, but you can at least estimate the death date from the probate date. This is another part of a probate record, and this is the wife coming forward and giving the deposition that says, my husband died at Albany in Greene County on such and such a date. So she's actually swearing to this information. And last but not least, here's a will. Now, what can we assume from this will? This man that I'm interested in, this John Snyder, he's a witness to this will. What does that have to do with anything? This was in Virginia and 1742. This is the earliest record that we have this man listed on any kind of paperwork. So I called to the state archives in Virginia and I asked them, how old did you have to be to witness a will? And she said 21. So I know he was born prior to 1721 in, I don't know where, but at least I have an approximate date for his birth. At least it's something, because it's the only thing I have ever found that indicated when he might have been born before that time. All right, I think we've come to the W's, so we're at the end of the alphabet, and I think that's all we have today. So we'll just leave you with this little note, and hold on, we've got a couple of questions, I believe.
Yeah, there's the first question. This is by Kathy.
All right, Kathy asked, what does it say?
Which of your, on the handout, which are primary and which are secondary?
Well, the primary sources, you keep in mind that they are created at the time of the event. So that's the key right there. I didn't mark them any differently, but you should be able to know when you look at these, if it's, let's see, I'm trying to think of, well, that will, that you know that's at the time of the event. Well, no. The one where the woman is swearing that her husband died on such and such. But you should be able to tell which ones they are. I would say the cemetery records, the funeral home records, those would be primary because they were created at the time of the death. And okay, here I have another question. Does the state of Kentucky have mortuary schedules? I don't know. I haven't searched them in Kentucky. You might be able to check online to see. I can't answer that. I'm sorry. What, you have another one?
Yeah. This is draft records.
What? Draft?
Diana said one thing about draft records is that the gentleman that's being drafted doesn't always use the real date of his birth.
Well,
so it's just something to go by. You have to remember that.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, I have a marriage record for my parents, and my mother didn't have her correct birth date on there, but that's very true. Those things do kind of creep in there. You just have to take it and, you know, figure out the accuracy of it. And if it's possible, find something else to support it or to dispute it.
It just helps you narrow in.
Yeah, it just helps you to narrow it down. Sometimes that's all you've got. So I thank you all for your...
Susan?
Yes.
I have a couple of questions I'm not sure have been asked yet.
Okay.
From Diane, I would be interested in finding that South Carolina list of coroners.
Okay. I will, I'll find that link, the URL that I have, that I found those, and I will put it out on Facebook, on the LGS Facebook page for anybody, because that's where it came from.
Okay. And from Ed Brown, are court custody records available for Jefferson County between 1870 and the 1880s?
I can't answer that. I'm sorry, I haven't done any of that. Can anybody else help with that question?
This is Nancy. I would consult the, what's called the Metro Archives. They might be able to answer that question for him. And I think
Okay.
you can Google Metro, the Louisville Metro Archives, and get their phone number.
Yes, and a lot of, they have a list of things that I think on their website that they have, so that might help too.
And Deborah Caposano just posted their website on the chat. So
Okay.
Metro Archives is really good for finding those kind of questions pertaining to Jefferson County or Louisville especially.
Okay, thank you. Is there
And
anything else?
Judy mentioned that unlike regular birth certificates, Catholic baptisms require the father's name.
Oh,
Mm.
okay. All right,
Require a father's name,
yeah.
as it may be unknown.
Just one?
That's a good hint also.
Now, that's how we found out. We had a DNA match, and they found out from their baptismal record what their father's name was because their mother never told them and she had died. So that's how we ended up hooking my uncle to them. So they ended up being my first cousins that we never knew existed.
Well, there's always other things that you can find that maybe I haven't thought about. So this has been my experience. I'm giving you records that I have used.
Yeah, this list is great. Thank you.
Is there anything else?
Here's one.
Okay, well, there's one more.
This is from Pat Meyer.
Uh-huh.
She said, Susan, I have Corliss in my family, but also don't recognize your first names. You know about the book written about Corliss family in America? It's a Google free book.
Yeah, this one was one, someone was mentioning the Corlisses, and they have Corliss in their family. This is Pat Meyer. Yes, I do. I've used that book considerably. You have to kind of take it with a grain of salt, though, sometimes.
Well, Susan and Bill, we want to thank you very much for your presentation, and your handout is great, and really appreciated the PowerPoint too. So thank you very much. And we want to thank everybody for joining us today. And I just want to remind you again that our seminar with Mr. James Beidler will be October 17th. Please go to our website, kylgs.org, to register. And then don't forget, I'm just reviewing, a month from now, the 4th Tuesday in October, we will have our workshop, DNA Methodology for Unknown Parentage. And our second Tuesday in November will be Grandma Was a Gun Mall. So please come back and join us, and thank you for attending today.